Hello, it's Susan here from Komori no Hime Cosplay, and today we're going to be making the dress from Disney's animated Cinderella. To make Cinderella's dress, I'm using Simplicity 0624. This is possibly considered a vintage pattern, not sure what the time frame for that is, but the copyright has it as being 2000. There is a more recently released Cinderella pattern available, but I liked the bodice shape and the skirt shape on this one, so that's why I decided to go with this one. I got it on eBay, if you're wondering where it came from. And for the fabric, I'm using a matte satin for the dress base, and then a crepe back satin for the sleeve puffs and hip puffs. Both of these fabrics I got from Joann's. I cut the bodice pieces out of some light blue cotton, basted them together, including a zipper, so this will essentially be my mock-up and I can get a feel for how it's going to fit. And it's a little bit too tight at the waist, so I am going to have to let it out some, most likely at the side seams. But now that I have an idea of what it's going to fit like, I'm going to seam rip all of this apart and then use these cotton pieces for the lining. Sew the cotton pieces to the satin outer layer pieces to flatline them. Sew the two front bodice pieces together along the center front seam and press it flat. Then we're going to cut a piece of covered boning to the desired length, pull the boning out of the covering and smooth the edges out. And while the boning is out of the casing, sew the casing to the center front seam, only sewing it to the seam allowance so that you do not see the stitching on the front. Insert the boning back into the casing and then sew the ends closed. I probably should have had my casing be a little bit longer, but oh well. Sew the rest of the bodice pieces together. When looking through the instructions, I realized it didn't say anything about finishing the inside seams and just left them raw, which is something I did not want to do. So I used a clean finish on them, and it sort of worked because I let out the bottom of the seam to give more width at the waist. I didn't really have enough fabric to do it as cleanly as I would have liked to, but at least it's not fraying all over everywhere like it was before. And I also added some boning to the side seams using the method that we used for the center one, though I did have to add the clean finish before inserting the boning, and I did have to rip out the boning in the center one, do the clean finish, and then put the boning back in. But now we have a base for the bodice and we can move on to the rest of the costume. Then I cut out the facing pieces and sewed a small hem along the bottoms and pressed the edges inward. They're not wanting to stay pressed very much, but it may also be because it's really hot today. Putting right sides together, sew the facing to the bodice. After the facings have been sewn into place, we're going to understitch them to the seam allowance to encourage everything to stay in place. Moving on to the sleeves, I cut the outer sleeve piece out of some crepe back satin that's in the same icy blue color. I cut the lining pieces out of some blue cotton, and then the stiffener out of some net that I had left over from another project. I also took a disappearing ink pen and marked the placement for the stiffening on the cotton. Now I'm gathering the netting down by hand and matching it to the markings that I made earlier, and I'll do this for the top and then do the same thing for the bottom. Once the netting has been pinned in place, we're then going to sew along the gathering stitch to attach it. After the netting had been sewn on, I then pushed everything inward and kind of crumpled it up a little bit and pinned it into place just so it wouldn't be in the way for sewing the seams. So then, as you can see, sewed the lining bit to the outside bit all along the bottom and along the top, just from about the top of the netting around to the ending of the netting, so it isn't completely connected at the sides here. And one thing I should point out is that when flipping it over, it does look a little bit silly because the outer portion is poofier than the lining, so it does tend to wrinkle a lot and bag up, so you do have to ease them together a bit. Clip the curved edges, and also clip in a bit at each of the stitching ends and remove the pins from the net. Turn the sleeve right side out and sew a line of stitching from the notched edge to the notched edge to act as casing for the elastic. Thread elastic through the channel and sew each end into place. Putting right sides together, sew the two ends of the sleeve matching the satin to satin and the cotton to cotton. Turn the sleeve right side out, then sew a casing for the elastic along the bottom of the sleeve, leaving a space open so that we can insert elastic. Thread the elastic through the casing and sew the two ends together. Tuck the elastic into the channel and sew the hole closed to complete the channel. Then we're going to match up the cotton and satin pieces and sew them together along the edge. Now that we have our sleeve poofs, we can now sew them to the armholes of the bodice. For Cinderella's hip puffs, I decided I wasn't really a fan of the shape and style of the hip puffs with this pattern. I thought they were a little too big, and when I held up the pattern pieces to myself, they were almost to my knees and looked out of proportion, and I was just not a fan. So I decided to use the hip puff pattern from the Simplicity Princess Peach costume and just made it a bit wider. And I cut those out of some of the crepe back satin, the same satin that I used for the sleeve puffs. Sew the dart at the top of the puff, and I also sewed a rolled hem along the bottom edge. Putting wrong sides together, fold the bottom edge of the puff and sew it into place. Gather the hip puffs and sew them onto the bodice. Cut the skirt pieces out of the blue satin and then flatline them. I'm using white cotton for the lining since that's the only material that I had on hand in a large enough quantity to do all of the skirt pieces. Take the 3 godet pieces and we're going to sew some horsehair braid to the front blue satin side, then flip it over to the cotton lining and hand sew it into place. I still need a bit more practice, but the goal is to sew it directly to the lining so you don't see any of the stitches on the outside. It's still a little puckery there, but I need a little bit more practice on that. Sew the 3 godet pieces together along the side seams. To make the rest of the skirt, I cut out the individual skirt pieces out of the blue satin and flatline them with the white cotton. Then sew the side front to the side back, center back, center back, side front, so that we have the back end of the skirt, leaving a space open in the back so we can insert the zipper later on. And then after all the pieces had been sewn together, we're going to hem them using the horsehair braid like we did for the godets. Sew the godet piece to the 2 skirt side front pieces to create the finished skirt base. Then sew the skirt onto the bodice. Insert the zipper into the back of the dress. I didn't film the step-by-step process of this because the pattern called for sewing in a lapped zipper, and I'd never done that technique before, but I think it turned out okay. Let's take a moment to talk about the inside of the dress. The pattern really didn't say much about finishing methods for the internal structure of the dress, which is one of my main problems with it, just because you put all this effort into making this dress, but then the inside edges are still raw. So on the underarm and at the waist, also along the raw edges before sewing in the zipper, I sewed on some black lace hem tape. Ideally, I would have used a color that better matched the dress, but this is what I had, so that's why I used this color. I also tacked the facing into place at the seams to keep it from flipping up. I did the same thing for the seams of the godets and where they connected to the skirt. I also sewed some grosgrain ribbon along the edges where the horsehair braid is so that the ends aren't poking out, and that part was something that was mentioned in the pattern. This is my setup for putting the rhinestones on the dress. The pattern called for putting the rhinestones on as the very last step, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because you need the pieces to be flat when you apply the rhinestones, and also, especially since I lined it in cotton, this dress is really heavy, so I'm having to put a book on it so it doesn't slide off the table. I tried on the dress, and since there was no support in the back section of the dress, it was wrinkling and really unflattering. So you can kind of see a little bit here. I added some boning. It doesn't go all the way up since my boning didn't really have much of a curve to it, but it goes from about here to the waist, and I did that on each of the side back seams, and that definitely made a difference with the fit. And with that, Cinderella is done. Overall, I'm quite pleased with how it turned out. I'm very glad that I decided to give this costume a try, as I feel like I learned quite a few new things and got to try out some new techniques. Though, as I've mentioned in the construction process, it's not necessarily a perfect pattern. There are some things that I would do differently if I was to remake it. But I hope you found this video helpful. For more cosplay tutorial videos, please subscribe, and thank you so much for watching!